I know we're still waiting for a few folks to find their way back to the room here, but again, just to be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to dive right in with our afternoon session. We've got 3 terrific panels this afternoon, and we're going to kick off with one regional innovation driving national competitiveness, which should be a wonderful follow-up to the discussion by Christian right before lunch. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panel.
Thank you. So once again, I'm Dylan Jones, the president of Canada West Foundation, and I'm moderating this panel. I will say, just for those of you who don't know, that Alberta in particular, in the West, is known in this country for driving political policy change. And at the heart of that has been a think tank called Canada West Foundation, one of the great think tanks in the country, if I may say so myself. And we're devoted to the regional prosperity of Western Canada. So we have a bit of a connection to this topic. I'm not going to reintroduce the topic. I think Christian did a fantastic job before lunch of setting the topic up. What unifies this group of panelists is these are 3 individuals who are global leaders in the practice of regional innovation. These are people that have been doing regional innovation, have been advising on it. They bring a great depth of practical expertise to the topic, and that's really what we're going to do. I think it's trying to develop Christian's points with a sort of ground level view. So to kick it off, my question is, in practice, when you're trying to drive regional innovation, what are the factors that matter most? And we'll open with Amit, if you want to take us off.
Dylan, thanks a lot. In fact, if you really look at innovation and economic development from a regional perspective, there are 2 or 3 things which matter quite a bit. One is we have to understand what are the basic conditions which are actually available within the region. And when I talk about basic conditions, that would mean what is the land, labor, capital that is actually available, and that what you traditionally call as factor conditions. But the question here is that how deeply can we understand what are the resources that are actually available within a region? The second thing is in terms of what is the kind of capital and what is the kind of infrastructure that is available for that. Whether we have the basic infrastructure in terms of venture capital available there or not, if you really want to innovate or if you want to create entrepreneurship and so on and so forth. And third thing, which is very clearly, and that's about labor and the quality of labor. I think we cannot underemphasize the idea of quality of labor. The biggest challenge in the world, across the world, is going to be whether the availability of labor is there or not. Because if a region does not really have the basic labor availability, it would not really come up or it cannot grow. Because if you're saying that I'm going to seed a cluster or I'm going to seed an industry, and there is no basic labor that's available there, it's going to be a gargantuan or a fairly difficult task to actually do it. First, I would like to give you 2 examples here. In fact, one of the examples I would like to bring from a city of Chandigarh in India, which actually wanted to be the IT cluster. And there was definitely no doubt that the city cannot actually be an IT cluster, even in spite of spending billions of dollars on development. For a simple reason, there was no availability of labor in that region. There was just about close to 600 engineers who were passing out of that location and whatever. And if you really look at the other side of the story, and there was this region, and everybody knows about IT in India, and you actually have Hyderabad or Chennai or stuff, or in Bangalore. And why did these places happen? These places happened for a simple reason, that there was huge impetus on education and educational infrastructure. And that educational infrastructure means that there are close to about 700,000 engineers which are actually passing out of that single location, or that whole area of just 3 cities, which is close to about maybe 2,000 square kilometers, and 700,000 engineers passing out of that location. So what we are saying here is that what is the availability of labor very, very clearly, whether I'm able to utilize that labor correctly, whether I'm actually understanding the local conditions and focusing on the right set of industry. And of course, like without a doubt, when you talk about innovation, like how do we really define innovation and so on and so forth, whether it is talking about just IT or it has to be beyond IT, there's so much that you can actually do with the various things that government can actually create value that has to do with that.
Thank you. Jeff, you want to?
Well, the things that we have in, particularly in the States, when we talk regional economic development or regional innovation, unlike the presentation that we heard before lunch, there are very few places in the States where we have such a thing called regional governance. Now, one could argue that a state like Rhode Island is an entire region in itself, or the state of Connecticut, or maybe Massachusetts. But after that, you can have states like Texas, Montana, big places that are going to be a variety of regions. So we're not dealing with regional government or regional governments making an impact. You're typically talking about a number of communities gathering together and creating a set of policies or creating entities. And those are much harder to do than when you truly have regional governments, because government should be able to tax, they should be able to then turn around and fund. I was talking to a city council member here from St. Albert at the reception last night, and he was talking about an attempt to create a regional economic development strategy for the Edmonton region. And they're having problems because these are voluntary issues. But I couldn't agree more with Emmett. The biggest issue, at least in the States right now, is workforce. And for us to be more successful in new types of businesses or growing existing businesses, it is the quality of workforce that is the one factor that is limiting growth in a fair number of regions across the country.
Well,
yeah, acting regionally, I think actions need to be sort of appropriate in scope and scale to the region in which you're operating. But they must also be outward looking. Christian's presentation actually was really my presentation in terms of how we operate within the European context. The British government writes a check, gives it to the local administration, and then you invest in that, whichever way you want it. Your destiny. And so one of the things that I would say is that the question one has to ask oneself is, what is your destiny? What's your destination? What type of society do you want to be in 2040, 2030, 2020? And from that, you look at your USPs or your unique service, sales, or value proposition, and then scan the world and look for partners within those USPs and partner and collaborate with those. So that's what I would think in terms of a general view of acting regionally, is how we would go about it. We currently have identified clusters, we're actually members of TCI, so we're quite acquainted with the whole cluster projects, from aerospace to food to, they're a mix, and maybe regions compete, but they're also a mix, and they're mixed differently. So it's looking for that collaborative region in the world that you can work with. So from our standpoint, from Ireland, Northern Ireland especially, and we have offices in Dublin and Belfast, we look at what's appropriate to the region, where the strengths are, what the USP is, and then look at how can we collaborate internationally with that particular area of strength.
how important, you talked a bit about the talent pool, but how important are universities and sort of the advanced education sector in general to successful regional innovation?
Oh, I think without a doubt, education is one of the biggest pillars which is actually going to drive regional innovation or competitiveness, for a simple reason, that if we do not have the basic educational infrastructure, I'm not going to have the talent pool. I'm not able to actually get that skilled labor which is able to contribute. And if you really look at it, it's the university system which actually drives a lot of innovation that actually happens in the world. Whether you talk about patenting or you talk about a newer set of things that are being done by the students. I would actually disagree with this morning comment, which was that, the patenting should not happen in faculty. I think the patenting should reside in people who actually do it, because that's where wealth creation is actually going to happen. That is where newness is actually going to come in. So if you really look at it, education is going to be the primary driving force. Wherever it actually gets accommodated, that's where things are going to happen. If you really talk about, say, a simple region like Boston, in fact, again, I will quote Professor Porter here, that Boston has, why did Massachusetts or Boston actually become what it is? Because there was a whole huge infrastructure in terms of the university system that was there, the whole set of laboratories, or the whole set of what I call the system in terms of doing work together, that created a lot of innovation. And that actually did drive the whole growth of the region. So across the world, if you really talk about, there is a clear evidence to the fact that wherever education is there, that is where competitiveness is actually going to be higher. If you really talk about Indian context, India is a subcontinent or whatever, if you really look at it, say the state of Maharashtra or the state of Tamil Nadu, which is doing well, why does it do well? Because basic education systems have actually been fairly good here, from say childhood education to say the secondary education, or say probably even you talk about the universities. So wherever it has actually happened, wherever the agglomeration has happened for the university system, that is where the driving, or that has been the driving force. And there's a clear evidence to that fact. And if you really look at the historical antecedents, if you look at the longitudinal data, without doubt, in the Indian context is true. And if you really talk about in the European context as well, I would presume that this is actually going to be fairly applicable as well.
Yeah, well, I may be a little bit controversial here. Universities, in my view, are not usually established to achieve regional economic growth in the 21st century. Universities, as I understand it, were established for teaching, for learning, including research, to create thinking, knowledgeable, smart kids, or graduates, and legislated for, by the way, in trade treaties, especially because the fruit of their research is for human good globally. That's how I see it. This is at variance, from my standpoint, with commercialization and IPR. Therefore, I think there's an absolute need to have properly constructed organizations to effect illegally those conversions of publicly generated knowledge into commercial innovation for local and economic growth and enhancement. I think ideal, you look at Stanford and RSI, and, Silicon Valley, these are preeminent, but I think they're often misunderstood and they're hard to replicate. That's my thesis. So I may be right. Universities don't like what I say, but that's how I see it. So we've got to have a construct that actually can deal with, the drivers are different. Universities are driven by research and papers. Business is driven by profit and driven by markets as opposed to university. So somehow we've got to get alignment here, and maybe through the Science Park organization which we run and organize in, that seems to work pretty well. We actually recently with Pricewaterhouse Cooper did research with the highest level of startups in the United Kingdom, beating Cambridge, which is something. And of course, the place is crawling with multinationals. But again, the construct is quite different from all being done in the university. It's been done in the Science Park, where there's a lot of collaboration with industry and academia work closely together outside the university campus.
No, I'm going to take it up from there. I will not say that universities are just not for the 21st century. I think very clearly, universities drive a lot of innovation. If you really look at the last 10 years, and who are the enterprises who have actually created the maximum level of wealth? If you talk about the Yahoos of the world, or the Googles of the world, or say Skype of the world, they actually all came up from the university systems. They were the young kids who were actually working in the university, and they actually did something remarkable, and that actually created a lot of value. So it is just the university system which gives that whole creativity boost that actually does imply something. It is just, I think there is, of course, there could be a situation where there is a large enterprise which is there, and then the universities come around it, or the city gets spread around it, and you might actually want to give an example of Detroit. But at the end of the day, I think you cannot take away the whole idea that universities do drive a lot of innovation. I'll take you back to the revolution, or the Green Revolution that actually happened in India. It was driven by the university system. So the Punjab Agricultural University came out with a very simple genetic thing where you were talking about a seed which was 2329, and then it actually just created the whole impetus for what happened in that country, because the whole Green Revolution actually happened with that. And there is also a very clear indication when the university system was not involved, and when innovation was not happening, and there are certain set of clusters and industries which actually went down. The most interesting one has been actually the Ludhiana sports goods cluster. It was the largest sports goods cluster in the world at one point in time, to being absolutely nothing at this point in time. And why did it actually happen? Because the base level systems, the businessmen were not really focusing on innovation. They were not really even understanding. They were not even talking to the universities. They were not talking to the who were driving that innovation. And they were just not able to imbibe what was actually happening outside. They were not even noticing it. And the whole industry just went for a toss. And it was a very simple thing that you were talking about an industry like, say, you talk about hockey. Hockey was moving to astroturf, and nobody understood that in that country. Or you were talking about badminton rackets, which were moving from, say, wooden-based rackets to carbon or graphite or whatever you're talking about. Very simple things, but nobody actually noticed it, and the whole industry went down. And if you really look at the other locations, it was the research that was driving it. And when you say research would actually happen within enterprises, or it would actually happen within the universities, but you cannot undermine the fact that the university system does really drive a lot of things. It does really give a lot of insights. And in fact, if you really talk about the Indian context itself, a lot of people would actually say that India is not a very competitive location. And I absolutely agree with that. For a simple reason, we do not have a very strong education system or a research-based system. That is why we are what we are. We are ranked about 60 in the World Competitiveness Forum's index. And why does that actually happen? Because we've just not been able to do it. We've just not been able to actually come out with products or solutions which are unique. It is just a replication society.
Jeff, just if you can reflect a bit on the U.S. experience on this topic.
So for those that are here in the audience, we had quite an interesting debate about this at dinner last night, which has led to this discussion. And I sat back and I took a different opinion, maybe closer to Bob's, in that while universities are great, and I'm not going to sit here and say that universities don't help in innovation, that they don't train great people, but I sat back and I put things in an early 1900s parameter, and I said, all right, so Henry Ford created, had the modern assembly line. Did he go to the University of Michigan to find that? And the answer was no. If we look at Whitney and his cotton gin, did he rely on some university to provide that innovation? The answer was no. Does the Ford family now contribute lots of money to the University of Michigan, and are they getting good designers and good engineers out of places like that? The answer is yes, but frankly, we are leaving out of this conversation the innovation side of business. We're leaving out of this an entrepreneur coming up with a great idea and moving it forward. And universities clearly can be supported. But they, in the context of the States, I'm sure there are interesting patents coming out of universities. There's interesting IP coming out of universities. But I would not sit back and say they are the clear drivers. I think it is, without question, it is business investment, it is entrepreneurs, and thank God there are universities, but that they are not, they are not the start and finish to our innovation and entrepreneurship system.
They're enablers. I stood last week in front of a dragon's den, okay? I had 4 slides. Who are you? What problem are you trying to solve? What technology are you going to use? And what's the market? 20 minutes, I got to 40,000. But I had the university guy with me to talk technology, advanced technology, but he was there as an enabler. It wasn't his idea. Do you see where I'm coming from? It's business driven.
So one of the things that people observe in the American experience is the extent to which the government in the United States doesn't just fund direct research, they fund finding solutions to problems. Right? So they which is another way of saying they fund innovation directly rather than funding research directly. Is that another source? Because we talked about the entrepreneur as the source. We talked about, in some contexts, the university as the source. Can public policy directly prime innovation?
Well, I think it should support informed decision without dictating the outcome. In other words, if it fails, it fails.
Public policy very clearly. I think what you're asking is a clear thing as to what is the role of the government in the school system. I think the role of the government is to just really provide the environment or the basic conditions in which they can actually operate. Because the moment they start interfering in something, it will just fall flat. At least there is a very clear nature of what happened in India. From say 1991, when government started withdrawing the whole kind of interventionist approach that it actually had, that's when the country started improving, actually growing. So that means like the role of the government is actually fairly detrimental at points in time to the growth of nations. So the role of the government is to just provide that basic environment, get the basic conditions right, and then it is always going to be business which is going to create wealth. Because the solutions to problems, as you say, are always going to be given by businesses. It's not going to be anything else. Even today, if you really look at it, there is also a very clear debate which says that there is a whole huge linkage between the societal objectives and the economic objectives. If it is not, had it not been true, then the whole system of capitalism would have actually collapsed. Because there are solutions that are actually happening, that is driving the world. And there is a clear evidence like that how the whole socialistic system has actually failed. Because that is where the whole the policy interventionist approach has actually collapsed the system. If you really talk about the Russian example, it has not been a very successful example. I think if you talk about a successful example, the Indian context, India was a very interestingly socialist, predominantly till about 1991. It was a fairly sad example of growth and what you would actually call as the Hindu rate of growth. It was just growing at about 2% or 3% for about 40 years after independence. And when is the growth rate, the scorching rate of 10% happened when government actually started to decline? So the role of the government is to just create conditions, nothing else. And probably invest in base level infrastructure, invest in, say, the educational system. But I think in that case, the private university system would actually be the driving force. And in fact, I will just take it from him as well, that the innovation that can actually happen, a lot of innovation would actually be driven by enterprises. And that is where a lot of patenting behavior could actually be seen and things.
So I want to talk about the U.S. context in 2 or 3 ways very quickly. One, we have just had a major change in government. The Republicans now control the Senate, the Republicans control the House in a stronger way than they did before this most recent election. And the reason that I'm pointing this out, which probably many of you are already aware of this, is there is some politicization of investments the government makes. A more conservative government will not pick so-called winners and losers. And the libertarian movement in the Republican Party would have you not making certain types of investments in business, particularly if it's viewed as picking winners and losers. Second, I don't think we'll see much investment or even R&D in alternative energies. Because there'll be people from various states that are doing very well in the carbon world that will push back. And so we'll see the government backing off in some of those areas. The one thing that I think we will see is we have what we refer to as a research and development tax credit. I'm pretty confident that that's going to move forward, and that puts the onus back into the private sector, which gets back to the point we were making. If the private sector is making smart research and development decisions around their business lines, and it kind of gets spread across most businesses who are doing R&D, then that's probably a net plus.
So there's a piece here that I'm so confused about. And we've heard a lot about strategy today. And we've heard about what's your destiny. So I understand at the firm level you can solve specific problems. What value are you going to create for whom? So I get that at the firm level. But when we talk about regional innovation, we've been talking about strategizing. Who's going to do that?
Government have a role at a macro level. Government have a role at a macro level. But in reality, the innovation will come out of the industry, the commerce, the enterprise. I think what we find is, and research, of course, again, how do you commercialize the research? I work for a major multinational, and for years we did our own advanced research, we did our own R&D, we did our own product development, we did all that. Got to the stage came that when we couldn't afford to do that anymore, we put all that research back into the university, and we ended up on product development. The problem was that we didn't have a clue what was going on with the university unless we went in and looked through the patent book to find out what was happening. That's my earlier comment about we need a construct, something to get for that advanced research so it's readily available in the market. Therefore, we need a different construction. Now, as I said earlier, there are universities who are more engaged that way. In Europe, it's very difficult, at least my experience in Europe, it's very difficult to get the academics to engage because they're measured differently. They're interested in producing papers, that's how they're recognized. My business is recognized when I make a profit and I get a market, somebody buy my product. It's a different driver, and therefore you need to have some construct to actually drive innovation forward within the region. And I think we have nearly got there in terms of the science park construct we use, which is a halfway house between two. So that's how you really get your innovation out into the market. Yeah.
So I think the United States is probably a little late at the game in terms of figuring out what its role is in what are the types of investments and types of businesses, the types of innovation that might well stay in the States. And I say that because for the longest time, you know, we had a good marketplace among the 50 states. You could create steel in 2 or 3 different places. You didn't have to worry about things being shipped in from offshore. We had the capital, we had the trained labor, we had the investments, the entrepreneurs that could do so. The world has changed significantly in that you can put steel on a ship in Korea or China and ship it and probably bring it in at a cheaper price than we. And we weren't prepared for that adjustment. You could build cars in Japan and they were brought to the United States. We weren't prepared for that adjustment. And the US is still at the national level, I don't think, prepared to deal with those issues. In fact, every country in the world, or at least every industrialized country in the world, had a foreign direct investment promotion agency, but the United States. We weren't even prepared to help recruit companies to the States until the last 3 or 4 years. And then there was an organization set up, Select USA. But so the stepping in to that void have been regional organizations getting the input of the business leadership in their communities and the local governments and state agencies. And there have been significant investments and significant thought leadership at a subnational level to think about some of the clusters and some of the ways to approach growing regional innovation across the U.S.
So, Nigel, we just wanted to add something here. When you talk about, we have worked in the area of trying to understand what the strategy for a region should actually be and how do we actually do that. The basic thing is that we have to involve multiple set of people. And who are those people? The government has to be involved, the business has to be involved, the civil society has to be involved. And I think the biggest danger here is that everybody or everyone wants to be, say, the innovation hub or the IT hub or whatever. And I think that's the biggest danger that we face today when we are trying to develop a strategy for a region. Because at least in the Indian context that I'm talking about, every state under the sun wants to be the IT hub or the green tech hub or the clean tech hub or whatever. No, it is not going to happen. So what we need to understand is that we please understand what are the local conditions. Talk to these people, understand what businesses can actually do well there, understand the basic conditions. So if you really look at the automotive industry in India, it's a very interesting example of how it actually emerged. In fact, the government of India actually seeded a factory called Suzuki, called Maruti Suzuki in Delhi, but that whole cluster is dying because it was not the right location. It is actually exceedingly expensive to export out of that location. And we have seen that there are other regions, there are 4 other regions which have actually emerged. And why did they emerge? Because there was a clear-cut understanding what needs to be done in those regions. What is it that you could actually do in those parts of the world? So if you talk about Ahmedabad, or if you talk about Pune, or if you talk about Chennai, why have they actually become the automotive hubs? It's very simple, that the clear understanding between the policymakers, the civil society, and the business was there. They clearly understood what that region is actually good for. And that is how that whole cluster actually just, emerged over a period of time. It did not happen overnight. It did take about 10 years or 15 years for that really to happen.
You asked the question of strategy. To me, all regions will have to find their economic place in the world, okay, at large. And the answer may be based on a set of, similar things, but the mix will be unique, as the region is unique. What makes Switzerland unique? Finland unique, for example. What makes Sweden unique? What makes Ireland unique? And so on. The mix may be similar but different. And I think, everyone's into energy, or everyone's into, agriculture, or that's okay. The mix is going to be different, and you need to area.
So the piece that, and I think we're getting closer, the piece that I'm struggling with is, we have a strong market ideology that's being expressed in part today, which is government should be general. Low taxes, good education, don't make winners and losers, stay out, let the, right? So we have on the one hand that sort of classic, now under that model, presumably the cluster formation is organic, not strategic. So, in the sense of being directed from somewhere. So, but I'm hearing this element of strategy still in the answers, which suggests that someone is bringing together civil society, industry, universities, and convening and building partnerships, doing all the other things we're talking about. So it's that element of, so I guess to simplify, do you think every region finding its unique place in the world, its value propositions, et cetera, just happens? Or is it a deliberate?
Well, there's cultural things. There's a whole package of differentiators that makes a region different from another region. And it's not just one thing. It's a societal thing. And there's issues around branding, there's reputation, all those things go together to get a mix. There's your tier 1 industries, for example. In the case of Ireland, it's airspace, it's food and drink. And there's a lot of excellent research going on, all those things within the universities as well as in industry. So it's where you're predominant, and then you can bring that in the global mix and become unique within that cluster.
So my members, who are the economic developers, both at the city, county, state, and regional level, any of them worth their salt are convening local governments, business community, investors, every 3 to 5 years to do an updated strategic plan for their region. And they're going to learn from what has been going on. They know who is closed, who is grown. They know where the capital access is. They know where their infrastructure is. All of the components necessary to create good economic development. And I would tell you that the top regions in the country do that on a repetitive basis and do it fairly well. Where there are problems is in those places who have bled investment for some period of time.
Yeah.
And it is, they've had a military base close. Lots of communities in the States that had a military base that is no longer there. Or they've had a major factory close. Or they've had a resource depletion. And it is at that point that at least we see our federal government step in with economic adjustment money to help those communities see a different future for themselves. And it oftentimes, and you were talking 20 to 50 years last night at dinner, to kind of find a new method for employing people, finding new types of industries, ability to use what resources you have left. And those are the hard cases. And we can look at a place like Detroit. You know, in 1960, Detroit had well in excess of 2 million people. Today, it's probably barely 750,000 people, and a completely changed industrial scenario. So we're going to be reinventing Detroit for a long time.
So I'm going to ask one last question. You can make, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Yes, just a very quick thing. When you talk about organic and not strategy, I don't think there is any resonance here. What is organic could actually be very clearly strategy. For a simple reason, like let me give you a very clear example here. Say the Bhagalpur region in India, which is supposedly makes the finest silk in the world, or at least in that part, in the Indian context. So why shouldn't it actually be that cluster? Why can't we actually create brands around it? Why can't you actually do something in terms of building units around it? You could actually do so much with, say, silk farming or mulberry farming and so on and so forth, because basic conditions are there. So it is just not that there is anything non-strategic about it. Clusters can be there, they've been seeded there, the artisans have been there for a long time. The question is going to be how you extract better value out of it. I think the clear focus has to be, what would innovation be here? The innovation would be that I have to extract better value with my products. Can I actually extract higher value for the silk that I actually produce there? In fact, yesterday night when we were talking about the Apple effect, the guy who controls the brand controls the profits there. It's not the Chinese who are making money out of it, it's the American firm which makes money out of it. So that is where it is. You have to actually have a very clear-cut thing as to innovate on that, create brands around it, create a celebration around it, and then extract value out of it.
So my final question is, now turn to the audience, thank you, is, you talked about the Chandigarh case, you talked about some tough cases in the US, and they're more than Detroit. You talked about some challenges in the model that are inherent in the model. My question is this, my observation of regional planning, to the extent that it exists, is there's an awful lot of sameness. There's an awful lot of regional innovation planning that doesn't really speak to what you call unique selling propositions. There's a lot of cookie cutter regional planning out there. Yeah. And we've all been talking today about doing it well. But you guys are guys who have been doing it well. You built your careers doing it well. So what last piece of practical, non-philosophical advice would you have for what we need to do to make sure that when we do regional innovation, we do it well?
Well, let me speak from a context for the little country that I come from.
Yeah.
A few of the barriers to innovation, they're based on a lack of knowledge and inappropriate people having most influence. That's put it bluntly. In the case of Northern Ireland, for example, it's the old style developers, property owners, as well as purely locally based business people who are guiding the leaders wrongly. So it's having the right people in the right place with the right knowledge. And unfortunately, if it's localized knowledge, then this is the global perspective. So that's a barrier from our experience.
So, as opposed to everybody being a biotech hub, or an IT hub, or a green technology hub, what we ought to really be looking for as communities is what are we truly unique at? So, and that hit me a few years ago. I was in Dayton, Ohio, and they were developing an incubator to focus on RFID technology. The little things that you put in on the tags you put on merchandise in stores. And they, National Cash Register, now known as NCR, used to be headquartered in Dayton, Ohio, and they left and then moved to Atlanta. But they left behind lots of really smart people. They left behind people that understood technology. And there is only going to be one incubator in the US focused on RFID technology, and that will be